Many books and documentaries often state that in the latter half of their lives, there was a rift between Charlie Luciano and Vito Genovese. But was this really the case? Let's check it out. Welcome to OC Shorts, bringing you detailed historical snapshots of the American Mafia and other organised crime. Feel free to subscribe if you like that sort of thing. Today, we're going to take a quick look at the relationship between Charlie Luciano and Vito Genovese. There are many rumours about the deterioration of Charlie Luciano and Vito Genovese's relationship that are often relayed as facts. These include Luciano beating up Genovese in Havana, Luciano stealing Vito Genovese's heroin network, Genovese questioning Luciano's leadership, and Genovese alerting the US authorities regarding Luciano's presence in Cuba. I sat down with Nev Morgan, a mob historian and author of a new book on Luciano called Charlie Lucky, the Broadway Gangster, to discuss the relationship between Vito Genovese and Charlie Luciano. Little is known about the relationship between Vito Genovese and Charlie Luciano in their early years, apart from what we are told in the discredited book The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano, a book allegedly based on interviews held between Martin Gosch and Lucky Luciano. In the book, Luciano allegedly told Martin Gosch, "In his old neighbourhood in Little Italy, Lucania found a young and ambitious hoodlum who was an obvious recruit and who rose rapidly to a position as a major aide in all Lucania's enterprises. A short, muscular man with a round face and a wide smile, a secretive manner and a willingness to use a gun with no mercy. His name was Vito Genovese. I never really liked him, but he did have moxie. I figured that if this Vito had even a part of Meyer's guts, remember he was a little guy like Meyer, then I'd have a good man." However, as mentioned, many historians have discredited this book and the stories that it includes. What is known from various sources is that by the late 1920s, Luciano and Genovese both headed up crews in Joe the Boss Masseria's organisation. Luciano's crew including the likes of Thomas Tommy Palmer Greco, and Genovese's crew, which would go on to be famously known as the Greenwich Village crew, and included the likes of Anthony Tony Bender Strollo. In April 1931, crime boss Joe Masseria is murdered. And after the Masseria murder, Charlie Luciano took control of Masseria's family. Both Vito Genovese and Charlie Luciano are linked with a conspiracy to murder Joe the Boss, as shown in the following FBI file, based on information from mobster Nicolo Gentile. Immediately after another of Masseria's followers fell, and the remainder of his group gave him an ultimatum to rearm, he opposed them, and Al Capone, a capo de decina affiliated with Masseria's Borgata, was called by the group, who, with Vito Genovese, aka Vitone, had decided to kill Masseria. Masseria, who was to have a restaurant meeting with his immediate supporters, including Joe Biondo, Vincenzo Mangano, Nicolo Gentile, and Toto Laverde, was killed in a restaurant in Coney Island. Lucky Luciano, at his home, met with Vincenzo Troia and told him to go to his compere, Maranzano, with a message to the effect that "we have killed Masseria for our own personal reasons, not to serve him." Charlie Luciano installed Vito Genovese as his underboss, perhaps an indication of how highly he thought of him at this time. Nev Morgan, a mob historian and author of the book Charlie Lucky, the Broadway Gangster, shares his thoughts on the pair of mobsters at this time.
In the Italian underworld, I guess you could say, Charlie's right-hand man had always been Vito. And Vito was just as ambitious as Charlie was, quite volatile, aggressive, everything. But Charlie kind of had that aura about him, that charismatic character that he was, the ability to lead. Vito noticed or knew that. And the only way to climb the ladder was with Charlie, and they, I guess, they sort of fed off each other too. That was their relationship there. Although Vito wasn't like as friendly with the Jewish mafia mob, or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, Charlie was Vito was side by side with Charlie all the way, really.
Later, in 1931, it is stated that the new boss of bosses, Salvatore Maranzano, drew up a list of mobsters that he wanted to have killed. And on this list were both Vito Genovese and Charlie Luciano. History states that Maranzano hired Vincent Mad Dog Cole to then kill both Luciano and his right-hand man Vito Genovese at a meeting. But as we know, Luciano struck first, and through his close Jewish associates, he had Maranzano murdered in September 1931. When Charlie Luciano is incarcerated in 1936, it is often stated that he installed Vito Genovese as his acting boss. Interestingly, there is another school of thought that speculates that a mysterious individual by the name of Chi Gazzei became Luciano's first acting boss in 1936, but only for a short period until he died of natural causes, as seen in the following FBI file based on information provided by Joseph Valachi. When Vito Genovese fled to Italy after the murder of Ferdinand Boccia on September 19, 1934, and Charles Luciano was imprisoned, Frank Costello took over as boss, after a man named Chi Gazzei, who was boss for a year, died a natural death. However, almost nothing is known about the mysterious Chi Gazzei, and therefore his role is a subject of much interest and debate amongst historians. In 1945, Vito Genovese is brought back from Italy to face murder charges, which he eventually beats in court halfway through 1946. And that same year, Charlie Luciano is released from prison and deported back to Italy. At this point in time, Frank Costello is considered acting boss of the family, with Willie Moretti as his number 2. Famously, in late 1946, Charlie Luciano comes back across the Atlantic from Italy and eventually arrives in Cuba, where he plans to try and continue to run his business. This brings us to the famous Havana Conference. The Havana Conference actually appears to be a series of meetings held over a period of weeks. And it is at this point in time that many books and documentaries state that Charlie Luciano and Vito Genovese's relationship deteriorated immensely. Out of the Havana Conference, we are often told a series of stories regarding Luciano and Genovese's relationship. They include Vito Genovese being angered that Charlie Luciano has taken over his heroin network, Vito Genovese questioning Luciano's leadership now that he's been deported, Charlie Luciano beating up Genovese, and Vito Genovese alerting the US authorities to Luciano's presence in Cuba. I asked author Nev Morgan his thoughts on the Havana Conference and the Genovese-Luciano rumours.
From November to February, it was like groups of 3 or 4 of them sort of went down there. And I've got to manage to get airline passenger manifests, and it had their names on it. The people who went to see him. There was, Frank Costello, Meyer, Jimmy Blue Eyes, Joey A, Vincent Mangano, Joe Profaci, Willie Moretti, I think, was there. Just in dribs and drabs, they sort of went down there. But I found out also, too, there was sort of like a little conference in Miami, held in Miami, just prior to Charlie arriving or just after Charlie arrived in Cuba. But that's my understanding, and the whole rumor mill behind this is just like spiraled out of control. And people, unfortunately, people believe the stories because it keeps getting retold, rehashed out, and everything like that.
In this extract from Nev Morgan's book, we can review some of the flight manifests for the Havana meetings. We can see that Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky travelled together, arriving on December the 1st, 1946, and returning to Miami on December the 3rd. A few days later, we see Joe Adonis and Vincent Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo arriving on December the 6th and returning to Miami on December the 9th. On December the 13th, Willie Moretti, Vincent Mangano, and Jerry Katina arrived in Cuba and departed on December the 17th. And then, on December the 18th, 1946, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and Vincent Allo all returned to Cuba and left on December the 21st. Ground zero for the stories about Luciano and Genovese's falling out appears to come from the discredited book The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano. Before this book came out, there was no talk of a rift between the pair. In 1952, Lucchese crime family mobster Eugene Giannini was murdered. Eugene Giannini was involved in narcotics smuggling, and in the early 1950s had been arrested in Italy. Whilst in jail in Italy, Giannini wrote a letter to a senior member of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, stating that he could provide information on Charlie Luciano's narcotics activities. After Giannini returned to the United States, Luciano discovered that he was an informer, and allegedly sent word to Vito Genovese that Giannini had to be murdered. Giannini was then gunned down by future Genovese family mobsters, the Pagano brothers Joe and Pasquale, and Fiore Siano, the nephew of Joe Valachi. Is the fact that Luciano reached out to Vito Genovese in 1952 about Giannini an indication that the pair were still on good terms?
Yeah, definitely it is. That whole incident there, it proves, or it's just, one of the things that sort of, proves that their relationship, their communications, their operations, their everything was still highly, involved with each other. And if there was any type of issues with them, they pretty much wouldn't be doing business on that type of level. Charlie sending off saying, "Listen, this guy's a rat. He's been talking to the feds, blah 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 blah. Knock him." And Vito does exactly what Charlie says. He knocks him and stuff like that. So that sort of cements their relationship still, and even Vito's involvement with Charlie. Charlie's thousands of miles away, and yet they still have that honor and respect with each other, I guess, is the good way of describing it.
Joe Valachi, who had been given the contract to kill Eugene Giannini by Anthony Tony Bendestrollo, and then recruited the Pagano brothers and his nephew to carry out the hit, would later recall to the FBI that he spoke with Vito Genovese about the murder, and Vito seemed pleased that they had managed to fulfill the wishes of Charlie Luciano. The FBI file states, Genovese then allegedly told Valachi to forget about it, adding, "I'm glad you took it. I wanted to get the first punch." Valachi recalled Genovese raised a balled fist as he said this. He stated he gathered from this statement that Genovese was pleased that one of his family was able to make the hit, because the information concerning Giannini had been sent to him by Charles Luciano. In 1957, it is said that Vito Genovese ordered the attempted assassination of Frank Costello. I asked Nev Morgan if there was any indication that this attempted hit bothered Luciano, or if Luciano, who had been deported for a decade at this point, would have just considered it business and part of the life that they chose.
Yeah, yeah. I think business was business. He was pretty much far removed by that time. Although there's indications to say that the commission used him as sort of like an arbitrator, and to sort things out. And you know, 1957, Charlie's 60 years old by then, maybe 59, 60 years old. I think he was more interested in his own business going on over there. He'd lost hope of trying to come back into America by then. So I think he knew Vito wanted top spot. It was always going to be the way. If Charlie stepped aside or whatever it be, Vito would be in there. I think Vito, I guess, had the right to make a move. Maybe not that aggressive, but that's their lifestyle. That's the way it goes. And I think maybe, do I believe Charlie knew? I don't think Charlie knew that it was going to happen, but I guess he sort of just accepted. Yep,
As mentioned, ground zero for all of the stories about a falling out between Vito Genovese and Charlie Luciano come from the discredited book The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano. It is from this text that many documentaries and books tend to regurgitate the story that the pair of famous mobsters would eventually despise each other. However, interestingly, Joseph Valachi, in his famous testimony, makes no mention of a rift between the two, and neither does Joe Bonanno in his book Man of Honor. I asked mob historian Nev Morgan his thoughts on this.
I think they built a solid base, from when they were like kids, and that just grew with them as they went through, and in all of their operations together, and like some of the stories I heard, they would rob stores together, and this is when they were kids, obviously, and things like that. And then when they got older, they'd go in and muscle people out of the way. We'll take over your business, da 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 da, and that went right all the way through. And then all of a sudden, you get all of these things, people, things saying, "Oh, there was conflict between the two," and everything like that. And it is all from the Last Testament. From that point in time, every story involving Charlie sort of morphed into this fantasy little world type of thing, and everything involving Charlie. There was I had this was covered up, that was this. All of these stories manifested from that book, and for some unknown reason, it became gospel.
And this book, as you said, we've had conversations before on this on the internet. This book has been proved to be debunked. In fact, I think they mention events which Charlie talks about, which happened after. I think there was a hotel that he refers to, which wasn't even open until after he died.
Yeah, there's also in the book, it says that during the Vice trial, Charlie would go back to the Waldorf with Frank Costello, Vito, and Meyer, and hold these meetings to say, this is what's going to happen, what we're going to do. But he was already held in custody, and they did not let him go one little bit. They held him in the Raymond Street jail, which is like this medieval fortress type of thing. And then there was other things that he was still having the ladies come around and see him, and all of this. It did not happen at all. He was enemy number one. They wouldn't let someone like him just go back to his hotel suite and let him do what he wanted. No, it just that did not happen.
For anyone interested, checking out Neb Morgan's book, Charlie Luciano, the Broadway Gangster, I included some links to this in the comments below. Let me know your thoughts on Charlie Luciano and Vito Genovese's relationship in the comments below. I hope you found that interesting. Thanks for watching.